and a warm welcome to the latest edition of Conversations in Drug Development, brought to you by the team at Boyd's. This podcast is for our fellow community of scientists and clinicians working in the wonderful world of cell and gene therapy and drug development. Thank you for tuning in, and we hope you enjoy the conversation.
Hello and welcome to Conversations in Drug Development. My name is Harriet Edwards and I am your host for today's episode. We're kicking off our 2026 podcast schedule by tackling potentially one of the biggest upcoming changes to EU regulation, for biotechnology products at least. Yes, of course, we're talking about the EU Biotech Act, and I'm pleased to be joined by two previous podcast guests and regulatory experts here at Boyd's, Kelsey Lennox and Eamon McGowan. Kelsey, Eamon, welcome to the podcast. I'm really pleased to have you on today.
It's great to be here, Edward.
Always good to be with you.
Excellent. So let's dive straight in then and talk about the EU Biotech Act for people that maybe haven't had chance to come up to speed with this. So Kelsey, maybe you could start by giving us a bit of a big picture overview of why is this being introduced and what is it?
So to start with, I think just, as you said, taking a step back and looking at the big picture. The point of the EU Biotech Act is trying to strengthen the EU competitiveness. Taking a look at the global landscape, the EU has acknowledged that they're starting to slip a little bit in terms of biotechnology growth in the area, as well as biotech staying in the EU economic area. And to just give you some statistics around this, in 2013, the global share of commercial clinical trials in Europe was at 22%. And in 2023, it dropped to just 12%. So it halved
Oh, wow.
that 10-year span. Yet during that same period, China's share of the global commercial clinical trials tripled from 5% to 18%. And similarly, from another competitive advantage, there's an acknowledgement that it just takes longer to get approval of clinical trials and running clinical trials in the EU. Again, some stats here for you. In comparison to China, to have a clinical trial application review and approved takes 60 days, where in the US it takes just 30 days. In the EU, multinational trials take an average of 113 days. That's quite a long time. And so the EU Biotech Act is looking to make this landscape more competitive. One aspect is by reducing those review timelines, trying to shorten them, make that time to market that much faster, increase patient access, and also increase returns on investment. And another aspect that the EU Biotech Act is trying to target is also the lack of funding, particularly for late stage and promoting growth of those biotech companies in the EU. Just briefly, the primary funding program existing today is Horizon Europe, and that is due to expire at the end of 2027. And while the EU Biotech Act doesn't introduce a similar funding program, it does introduce opportunities for investment. And this is in the form of 10 billion euros under the EU Health Biotechnology Investment Pilot. There isn't a ton of information precisely how this mechanism will work, but again, in contrast to Horizon Europe, this would take the form of loans for investment, again, targeted for those late-stage companies to promote growth of their companies, help with large-scale manufacturing of their products, etc.
So it sounds like there is the potential for a lot of improvement, efficiencies, streamlining, and making Europe generally more attractive to products covered underneath this Biotech Act, which sounds like, from some of the stats that you've just given, Kelsey, it sounds like we need it here in Europe. So let's think a little bit more about the Act itself. When was it introduced? What does it actually cover? And then maybe we can move into what some of the key highlights are of the Act.
So the EU Biotech Act was first adopted by the European Commission on just December 16th of last year. So
it's relatively new.
Relatively new. And it is very broad. So today we're just touching on a few aspects around medical devices, clinical trials, genetically modified microorganisms. But just to be aware, this is a very large act that covers a lot of different topics, including agriculture, veterinary medicines, other things, again, all aimed at making the EU more competitive in the biotechnology area.
Yeah, so as you said, it's a really big document that's only recently been released as a sort of proposal. So I'm sure many people haven't had chance to read through it all yet, and we are certainly highlighting just some of the main points that we think are interesting discussions today. Certainly, this podcast is a signpost for further reading and investigation for those that may be interested, because I think we're going to split this podcast into a couple of sections so that we can cover things in a bit more detail. But even then, there's still so much to cover within this act. So let's think about some of the key takeaways for medicines and what the key changes proposed are within this act. And then maybe, Eamon, we can move on to talk about the implications for medical devices as well. So, Kelsey, key takeaways for medicines. Would you say, are there a few that we could highlight?
Definitely. There's three that kind of rise to the top that stand out for me, three main changes that are being proposed. The first being the concept of a core dossier, and this is in the context of submitting clinical trial applications. Right now, what that looks like, you have your investigational medicinal product dossier, your IMPD, and that's going along with each clinical trial application that you're submitting. The EU Biotech Act proposes the concept of a core dossier. So you can think of it like your IMPD serving as your backbone for your particular medicine that subsequent clinical trials would all refer back to. This is, I think, a great improvement in terms of reducing administrative burden, both on the sponsors as well as the reviewers. Sponsors are no longer having to maintain all of that regulatory information and ensuring it's consistent across multiple applications. You're now managing this single dossier that, again, subsequent clinical trials could refer back to. The reviewers, I think, benefit as well because they are seeing this single core dossier, and as it gets updated, they're seeing that once. And as new clinical trial applications are being submitted, they're referring back to that dossier that they've already reviewed, but now reviewing it in the context of that new clinical trial application. So I think this one stands out to me that I'm frankly very excited about because it greatly reduces that administrative burden.
Yeah, and very similar, I guess, for people in the US that are used to an IND system, Kelsey. So similar harmonization and more of a life cycle approach rather than isolated CTA documents per application. Yeah.
Yep. Very similar. Still some differences there, but similar concept where, right, you're effectively managing one part of the application for the life cycle of the product and not having to repeat that multiple times. The second topic that really stands out to me in reviewing the Biotech Act is a reduction in timelines. And there's specific criteria that need to be met, but in most cases, timelines are reduced by anywhere from 30 to 50%. There's really a target looking at multinational clinical trials, acknowledging that that's an area that really takes quite some time. I mentioned that 113 days average period to review those multinational applications. And so that's a really good improvement. It's not, I mean, it's an improvement. We'll take it, right? It's not maybe par with the US or China, but it's an improvement. And the way they're looking to achieve this is by harmonizing some of those application procedures across the member states. And in fact, there was a pilot program that was recently launched called the FAST EU pilot program that stands for Facilitating and Accelerating Strategic Clinical Trials in the EU, kind of a mouthful. But that FAST EU pilot program is really a trial run of this concept where it's for multinational clinical trial applications. There would be a single submission there's a reference member state that has a strengthened role whereby this reference member state really serves as the leader in terms of reviewing that application, responsible for the technical review of it, and the expectation that the other member states are relying on that review and assessment of the application. This FAST EU pilot program targets to have a decision in 70 days. So again, that's an improvement from 113 days. And so I would certainly include or encourage sponsors to look into that FAST EU pilot program, give it a try. It's voluntary to participate in it, but at least it gets you familiar with what this process might look like in the future. And hey, if you're going to get shorter timeline in your review, it's an opportunity. So I'd say go for it.
It's nice to hear that there's a potential harmonization with the cradle to grave approach to reviewing of clinical trial documentation. And it's really great to hear that there is a potential accelerated access to getting your clinical trial started. But of course, slashing timelines comes with increased pressure on both potentially the applicant and the reviewer as well. So I think it's worth mentioning that although there is a really positive side to this, it's definitely a consideration for applicants to be aware of, that timelines are going to be streamlined, and that means for review and response to questions as well, right?
Right, right. And I think more detail needs to come out of precisely what those timelines look like. I'd say from the applicant's perspective, knowing that there's a shorter timeline, that may mean any request for information they may come in sooner. But it's yet to be seen whether this truly puts more pressure on the applicant. I think from my perspective right now, it appears to put more pressure on the reviewers, in fact. And hopefully, you're filing your information and it's right the first time. That's always the goal. And so I'm hesitant to say that there's increased pressure on the applicant at this point, and really the pressure is on the reviewers, but this is hopefully achievable for them with the other mechanisms in place. Again, trying to harmonize what those regulations are, what those procedures are for reviewing the application. And again, that's what the EU Biotech Act is trying to target, is simplifying that process and reducing the regulatory complexity.
Yeah, it's certainly a very ambitious and positive spin on how we enhance and improve the experience for developers here in the EU. So definitely some positive key things to take away. One thing that I did notice from the Biotech Act is there are, as you mentioned earlier, lots of different elements and different areas covered under the medicines category, medical devices as well, agriculture, vet meds, etc., etc. But one thing I was really interested to see was that there's very little on the very novel and innovative sector of medicines and advanced therapy, medicinal products in particular, are not called out as much as I perhaps thought they would be. And I'm thinking specifically around genome editing technologies, which listeners to the podcast will know that it's a pet topic of mine to discuss. But it is worth mentioning that these novel technologies that do need a little bit more specific guidance are still not really mentioned in such a comprehensive act and a proposal by the EU. So something interesting to be aware of. There was mention of genome edited technology specifically when thinking about environmental risk assessments where they're not required. But other than that, there's very little on innovative products, right, Kelsey?
Yes, you're absolutely right. And I think it's important to highlight that. And I think, too, at this stage, the EU Biotech Act is a proposal. There's still, other legislative procedures to take place before anything becomes actually tangible and modifications are actually adopted. So maybe that's something we keep an eye on to see if this gets introduced later. But at this point, Harry, you're absolutely right. There's very little. The environmental risk assessment you mentioned, if there's very specific categories that it falls under, that might be waived. I think the only other item I saw was just in terms of the review timelines for advanced therapies, there was an additional 50-day assessment period, and that's proposed to be eliminated. And so that's That's an element there, trying to harmonize across the otherwise very fragmented regulatory frameworks from clinical trials for medicines, advanced therapies, med devices, etc. But in summary, yes, very little.
Yeah, and that's interesting. Thinking about medical devices, as you've just mentioned them, and the fragmented nature of both Europe in general in terms of various member states, we're also seeing massive changes in the medical device space anyway without this act, which I'm sure we'll talk about in a little bit more detail. But Eamon, just thinking about what the Commission's actually proposed for medical devices within the Biotech Act. What's the proposed changes there? Because there's quite a few, isn't there?
Yes, Harriet, indeed. In fact, it's been a very busy time for the Commission, the end of the year of 2025. And as we've heard Kelsey speak, the Commission has proposed an ambitious package of measures to improve the health of EU citizens, but also, really important, ensure the long-term resilience and competitiveness of the health sector. Now, from a devices perspective, the Commission has put forward not only the Biotech Act, but also separately a proposed revised set of rules for medical devices and IVDs. And we are going to cover that proposed amendment to the medical devices and in vitro diagnostics in a separate follow-on podcast. We'll here now just focus on the Biotech Act.
Yes, absolutely.
So,
Yeah, watch this space for a later
watch this
podcast.
space, yes. So if you think about what, I mean, we really are at a very exciting time in the industry. Innovative and personalized therapies, and they often combine the use of medicinal products with a medical device, and also in many cases IVDs. And as part of the development of such therapies, we do see that clinical trials of one or more medicinal products may need to be combined with a clinical investigation of a medical device, or even a performance study of an in vitro diagnostic medical device. So the authorization and conduct of such combined studies, they're very complex due to the application requirements of maybe 2 or even 3 union legislative frameworks. And also the fact that these studies are typically conducted across several member states, not just in one member state, but several member states. In
Mm.
fact, it's been our experience at Boyd's to have come across a number of cases where there was a need to gain approval for both a clinical trial for an investigational medicinal product and separately a clinical investigation for the device. And this has been made more complex in that where there are multi-state studies, the clinical investigation needs to be approved in each separate member state. So think about that. If you're running that across a number of different EU member states, you have to get individual approvals for the clinical investigation in each of those individual member states. So the
Yeah, it's
Commission
a
is
lot of organisation.
it's a lot. It's a lot of work, and it's a lot of duplication of effort across
Yeah.
all of the member states. So the Commission have recognised that this is a problem. So they've proposed a dedicated pathway for the authorisation and conduct of such combined studies via what's a coordinated assessment across member states. So what exactly is being proposed by the Biotech Act? Well, it's introducing Article 14C into the EU CTR. And what that will propose is that for the authorisation for a combined study, which is to be conducted in one or more member states, a sponsor may submit a single application for authorization. This is big.
Yay!
Really be a big game changer. And you can submit electronically through the EU portal to all member states in which the combined study is to be conducted. So it's introducing EU portals as well for submission, which is another welcome attribute. At the moment, where you're going to each individual EU member state, you may have multiple different portals that you have to access. So it's bringing it into one location, which is really, really good.
Yeah, that's really positive. A harmonised approach would be very much welcomed, I think, particularly for all of these elements that you're managing separately at the moment for combination products or medical devices on their own. So it's really positive.
And another great introduction is that if you have more than one sponsor, which can happen where you have a trial of a medicine and a trial of a device, you can designate one coordinating sponsor. So that's a really helpful addition and reduce a lot of administrative burden and documentation that you need to get introduced, and also controls as well that you need to put in place for studies. So really, in a nutshell, this is really, really quite welcome in that it's introducing a unified process for the submission and assessment of clinical trials that involve what I would call combination products. And just it has to be very welcomed.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, you've covered quite a lot of what I would say are the key advantages of the proposals in the Biotech Act for medical devices. And you also mentioned earlier that there is a proposal to revise the MDR and the IVDR too, and something that we definitely want to cover in more detail at a later date. But is there anything, Eamon, that you think might be worth mentioning now with regards to revision of MDR and IVDR in the context of the Biotech Act?
Well, in relation to the proposals to update the IVDR and the MDR, it's a separate proposal. And like the Biotech Act, it is quite a large document. It's over 170 pages. And it's also looking to address a number of practical issues highlighted by stakeholders and member states in operating the current frameworks that we have in place. So the proposal in the draft regulation is introducing several updates divided across a number of topics.
Thinking about tangible impacts, obviously we've mentioned multiple times throughout this podcast that there is a proposal. This Biotech Act is a proposal at this point, and there is going to be a period of time before any of these changes come into force and we start to see what really is going to make a difference as a result of this act. But Kelsey, maybe you can touch on what we could expect really from a tangible impact perspective of this act.
Yeah, I think, as you said, these are just proposals at this stage introduced by the European Commission. So I really think it is probably years we're talking about before we start to see tangible impacts. What's happening is the European Commission proposed the EU Biotech Act, and from there now it goes to the EU Parliament and the Council of the EU to debate, amend, agree, etc. So you can imagine that process will take some time, and that's why I say years before we start to see tangible impacts. Further, once those regulations are adopted, those regulations apply across the EU, where directives would be transposed into national law. So that can take some time there as well. So it's likely that any changes we do see, they're likely to enter force into stages over the coming years.
And in terms of, we've talked very briefly around the revisions of MDR and IVDR, and I think, Eamon, it's probably worth mentioning that the changes in the Biotech Act are sort of aligned to and separate to what is being proposed with the revision of the MDR and the IVDR.
It's aligned in relation to the combination studies and introducing a central process. And that's the main focus of the Biotech Act for medical devices and IVDs. The IVDR and the MDR is a much broader document that's impacting on this.
Excellent. Thank you. In terms of any other topics of interest within the Biotech Act and the time constraints that we have within the podcast, is there anything of any note that you think listeners would like to be aware of that they can perhaps go and look a little bit more into, or perhaps a topic for a future podcast that we can cover? I don't know if there's anything around funding, Eamon, that might be worth mentioning here.
Yes, well, really what I'd recommend to anybody is to read the explanatory memorandum at the start of the Biotech Act, as it's quite telling. It goes into how important biotech is to the EU, the economic structure. But biotech accounts for about nearly 1 million jobs in the EU, and 75% are in the health sector. But it's recognised that the EU's global share of venture capital investment in health biotech is only 7%, compared to 14% in China and 63% in the US. And
wow, that's staggering.
Yes, and even more interestingly, between 2015 and June 2025, EU startups received around 9 times less late-stage funding than their US counterparts.
Wow.
So that is quite a telling figure or statistic. So the Commission is aiming to turn Europe into a biotech powerhouse and make it easier for EU-based biotech companies to place their products on the market. So within Chapter 3 of the Biotech Act, there are some proposals in relation to funding access. I'll briefly just cover some of these. They aim to improve access to funding, including through a health biotech pilot. It's called the Biotech EU via the European Investment Bank. And as Kelsey mentioned earlier, the aim is to generate investment of up to €10 billion into the sector. And that's going to help firms overcome high capital costs involved in getting products to the market. There will be an EU late-stage capital booster. This is an initiative to enable certain projects to be recognised as high-impact strategic biotech projects, and that will improve access to later-stage growth capital. On top of that, there's going to be prioritised access to EU funding programmes. So biotech companies and projects falling within the scope of the Biotech Act may receive the preferred access to union-level financing instruments. And then at the national level, member states can additionally provide financial support for biotechnology as a strategic technology, provided that the measures are complying with EU state aid rules. There's quite a few other initiatives within there, but I think these are the really important ones to be aware of.
Yeah, it sounds like there's a lot of momentum within the Act to address some of the really quite mind-blowing statistics that you've just given us, Eamon. I can't believe that there is such a difference between the EU, the US and China with regards to investment from venture capital. It's quite amazing. So definitely something that the Biotech Act is hoping to address, and watch this space. Hopefully we will be able to turn the EU into even more of a biotech powerhouse and retain talent and innovation across the EU, because I think we can all agree we have very much the hub of the initial phases of innovation that sometimes we lose to other places in the world for good reason, as we've just seen from those stats. So, Kelsey, I'm going to give you the really difficult challenge of summarising what are the key takeaways from the Biotech Act that we've covered today. We've covered an awful lot. And just in the closing phases of the podcast, I wonder if there's any key highlights that you think listeners should take away with them from today's episode.
Mm-hmm. Well, with respect to medicines, I think the key takeaways are, those opportunities to harmonize procedures and that are accounting for more risk-based regulatory decision-making, and thereby simplifying some of these regulatory processes. I mentioned the FAST EU pilot program. I think that's a great opportunity for sponsors to partake in, get a feel for what that might look like, experience hopefully those reduced timelines. And then the funding opportunities we were just talking about, the goals of this Biotech Act are to promote the growth of innovation in the EU, but then keep it there as well. So I think continuing to watch this space, understanding what investment opportunities are out there for sponsors to take advantage of, and then otherwise just continuing to watch. More pilot programs may come to the surface. I think those are always excellent opportunities to take part in. It gives you a feel for what future regulation changes may be coming, and an opportunity to feel that out firsthand before it becomes enacted.
An excellent summary of all of the potentially massive changes for the future landscape for the EU in particular, but also I think if there are these big changes coming across to the EU as a result of the proposal in the Biotech Act, there are potentially consequences to other areas of the world in terms of consequences where we might be retaining development and innovation in the EU that is then consequently lost from other areas of the world. So watch this space. I think it's a really interesting topic to discuss, potentially really, really positive. As with all of these proposals, we have to wait to see what actually comes out in the wash, and then what we have to work with later down the line. But we will absolutely be keeping an eye on this and providing updates as and when they become available, and as and when we get experience with the tangible things that are implemented as a result of the Act. So please do stay tuned to the podcast for more updates. Kelsey, Eamon, thank you so much for providing your input and expertise and insights today. It's been a fascinating episode as always, and we very much look forward to hopefully having you again on the podcast soon to discuss some of these potential positive changes when hopefully we have some positive experience with the Act later on.
Absolutely. Thank you, Harriet. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks, Harriet.
Thank you very much, guys, and we'll look forward to speaking to you again soon.
Thank you for listening to Conversations in Drug Development, the podcast series brought to you by the team at Boyd's. Don't forget to follow us on the usual podcast platforms or visit our website to ensure you don't miss out on any of our future episodes.